part of the clerk's responsibility is to set the tax rates in Cook County, from big places like Chicago to small places like the Ford Heights Park District. In that capacity, we also have a fiduciary responsibility to put out a TIF report. So this is our annual TIF report. And after a couple of comments from me, you're going to hear from our Director of Taxes, Tasha Gibbons, and from our Manager of, what we call it, Tax Extension, okay, Tanya Anthofer, two sterling examples of good government employees. And they will go through some of these numbers in a little more detail than I am, okay? And then, of course, take any questions. So let's just start with some pretty record numbers, okay? Number one, for the first time in history, the amount of money coming from Cook County taxpayers into TIFs is over $1 billion. In fact, it's so big that they had to reformat the mainframes so they could get all these numbers in there. So for the first time in TIF history in Cook County, it's over $1 billion. Looking at Chicago, for example, a more even stunning number, if you understand politics and taxes, and that is, of this property tax collected in the city of Chicago, over 30% of it is going into TIF areas. Now, this is stunning if you follow the history of TIFs over the last several years. A couple other quick numbers. In the city, roughly 1 in 4 properties are in a TIF. That would be astounding to most citizens that do not realize it. In the suburbs, 1 of 22 properties are in a TIF. A couple other key numbers. We have in the release that you can see the top 10 highest revenue TIFs. Okay, they're those that generate the highest revenue. Basically, that comes to about $322 million. Okay, I'm talking about the city alone now. $322 million, or almost 50% of the total take. That's the top 10. Remember, there's 143 TIFs in the city of Chicago. So the top 10 are generating almost 50% of the total revenue. The bottom 100, okay, there's the top 10, the bottom 100 are taking in $110 million, only 17%. And this is why many of us refer to sometime the TIF experience, particularly in Chicago, as a tale of two cities, okay? Let me just make a couple other points here. Why is this 30% so important? Now, this 30% that I just mentioned in Chicago from the property tax take is $660 million. So the real question is, how is this money decided upon, the $660 million, and who decides that? Okay? Because I want to talk to you about the process briefly to give you a flavor of where we need to go if we're concerned about fairness and equality. Okay, number one, of course, you've got corporations and business that have a perfect right to hire people at $500,000 a pop to research carefully every aspect of TIFs, to know when, what the rules are, how the best way for them to get as much as they can, okay? Then, of course, you've got the mayor, who has an important role, and then you have the city council, which is supposed to reflect the larger public on these decisions. But if you ask yourself, who is really keeping an eye on this $660 million? It's not the alderman, okay? Yes, the mayor, has often been described as a massive slush fund, and of course corporations, they have a perfect right to hire the best lobbyists they can. You ask, though, why are not aldermen debating the $660 million openly? And that's partly because of a long-standing process called aldermanic prerogative. What I'm trying to suggest to you is why we have this massive inequality and what could be done about it. Why might we have aldermen that have 1% of the funds, maybe many of them, not speaking out about those who might control 40, 50, 70% of the funds? Aldermanic prerogative, at least historically in Chicago, goes into zoning. And basically the whole notion is that each alderman is king or queen in his or her ward, that they get to make whatever decisions on zoning. I've always felt that was a bad policy because every one of the 50 aldermen legally represent all 2.7 million Chicagoans, okay? So, and there's other problems with aldermanic prerogative. As we know, there's been a large number of people going to jail because of zoning deals and pay-to-play activities when the aldermen are king or queen of zoning issues in their own ward, okay? But it's very popular, Okay. Also, we've had reports for years, the most recent one from Metropolitan Planning Council on the cost of segregation, that the massive inequality, racism, particularly in housing and schools in Chicago, is largely because of the same aldermanic prerogative. So the obviously thing is if powerful aldermen can say, no, we don't want any poor people in subsidized housing live in our neighborhood, that's basically what's happened over the years. Okay? So I'm suggesting the same problem relates to TIFs. Okay? Now let me give you an example of what's considered a very successful TIF in many people's minds is called the River West. And again, I'm not saying that this is particular bad. I'm trying to give an example of how we run this TIF process more fairly. Okay, so the Chicago River West, okay, and you can see it's in a map and so forth. Now they have generated a great amount. For example, they started in 2001, and right now they've generated $186 million. It's a fairly small geographical area. I have a map, but if you need that, you can look at it later. But $186 million over these since 2001. Now, let's look at the criteria to have a TIF in what's called River West. I'm just going to give you two examples of the two top things of what qualifies them. It says 91 out of 103 buildings in this particular geographical area were older than 35 years. I want you to think about that. We're older than 35 years. You go to Garfield Park, you go to Austin, you go to Englewood, you go to almost any place in the city. You go to Rogers Park, all the buildings are older than 35 years. You're lucky if they're not 75 to 100, okay? So why in the world does that qualify? Because buildings were older than 35 years, okay? Secondly, according to information provided by the City of Chicago, 70 or 68% of the buildings in the project area were cited for violations. Do you know how many buildings are cited for violations in most of Chicago's neighborhoods? You can have fairly nice buildings that are cited for violations. What I'm suggesting is just think of those reasons that we've now poured $142 million in there, and then let's look at the other impacts of that. First of all, you now have a situation with all this money poured in which many people who've paid the taxes for this are being driven out of the neighborhoods because of massive gentrification. Many of the buildings now built, partially related to TIF funds, to get a one-bedroom apartment, you might be spending $2,200 or more. Okay? So we need to think about these consequences, and that's why I come back to the aldermanic prerogative. Who decides that Chicago taxpayers are going to pour most of the money into downtown areas, like the maps show, and so much money into this particular TIF? Well, frankly, it's not the alderman, it's a couple of aldermen. Now, Walter Burnett, who is part of this district, to his credit, has called for more affordable housing in the area because he's seen how this massive movement of funds, which has benefited the well-off significantly, has also led to many people being driven out and a lack of affordable housing. So the point I'm making here, and I'm not trying to say there's benefits to come in the River West TIF and other benefits. I sponsored a TIF many years ago, City Council, and I think it was quite successful in the Rogers Park area. But this leads to the key questions of who decides and how do we decide policy when it comes to things like this. Okay, so because of the aldermanic prerogative, most of the aldermen will ignore whatever happens in this particular TIF. That's up to the one or two aldermen involved, okay? So I'm suggesting that this is a critical explanation of why we have the massive inequality in TIF funding that we presently have. Other things that we would suggest before I bring up Tasha and Tanya are we've also all called for very significant audits every year because many of these TIFs, they go on for 23 years. Yet even the River West one, it's very hard to figure out what still needs to be done, okay? And yet the money's going to keep pouring in at a large amount every year. So proper auditing and having all the aldermen or a much more transparent process would probably suggest ending the TIF sooner and taking the money elsewhere where it might be dramatically needed. Remember, while this $660 million is coming in and a little lesser amount last year, and 500 million the year before. Well, this is all taking place. We've witnessed the closing of over 50 schools, closing of mental health clinics, massive problems for the neighborhoods of Chicago. So we want the audits. We want to see where we can generate more surplus. But it's not just surplus alone. What's been happening for several years now, both under Mayor Daley and Rahm Emanuel, is that, see, if they could decide the surplus is all on their own, we got the same problem. That where is the impact, where's the public interest in deciding where those surpluses come from? And finally, keep in mind, for the $666 million that I mentioned, you take out the transportation TIF that they will explain in just a minute, okay? That'd be $620 million. That $620 million is a massive amount of money. Remember, when those are going into the TIFs, none of that money is going into the other taxing bodies. So none of that money that the taxpayers are paying are going to the schools. They're not going to city government. They're not going to county government. They're not going to city colleges, okay? The transportation TIF is slightly different, and Tanya will explain that. So the conclusion here, these numbers are fairly startling because of the massive growth. The key then is this is a real pot of gold. It's a lot of money. And the fundamental question is, are we spending it as wisely as we could, given we really do have a tale of two cities in Chicago, particularly with massive wealth in some parts of the city and massive amounts of poor in other parts. So with that, to go over some of the other numbers, and again, we will answer specific questions when you want. Tanya's going next, okay? Tanya Anthofer.
As David mentioned, this year, TIFs in Cook County are bringing in $1 billion. There are a total of 447 TIFs in all of Cook County. $660 million of that billion is coming from City of Chicago TIFs. And as David mentioned, that is about 30% of the total tax revenue coming into the City of Chicago this year. That's 143 TIFs in the City of Chicago. Conversely, $344 million is being brought in by about 304 suburban TIFs, and that's across about 98 suburban municipalities. Just to give you a little bit of a context for that $1 billion, we calculated tax rates earlier this year for all of the taxing districts in Cook County, and the total tax billed in all of Cook County is $14.4 billion. Of that, $1 billion is going to TIFs. That's 7% that's going to TIFs. In the City of Chicago, of all the taxing districts in the City of Chicago, 10% of all of that tax billed is going to TIF. In the suburbs, about 4% of the total tax billed for all districts is going to TIF. So every year, our office calculates the tax rates for all the taxing districts. The taxing districts, every year they hold meetings and they pass an annual property tax levy for the amount of money that they're requesting through property tax. They file that with us and we divide that by the total amount of value that's in the district to get the tax rate for that district. TIFs work differently. TIFs don't request a specific amount of money every year. What happens with a TIF is that a municipality decides to adopt a TIF. And at that time, the value within the TIF is frozen. Then, during the duration of the TIF, for the entire life of the TIF, which is typically 23 years, that frozen value is what is available to the other taxing districts when we calculate their rates. So any property tax revenue that's generated off of that frozen value goes to the taxing districts. But any property tax revenue that's generated off of any growth, any increase in value within the TIF, goes directly to the municipal TIF fund for that TIF. So just a few kind of points about our report today. For the City of Chicago, like I said, there's 143 TIFs in the City of Chicago. That's 2 less than last year. The city did not create any new TIFs this year. They did terminate 2 TIFs. The 126th and Torrance TIF dissolved after, it actually expired after 23 years. And then the Lakeside Development TIF, which is near the Southworks Mill, was terminated after 7 years without generating any incremental revenue. In the suburbs, 8 TIFs were terminated by a number of municipalities, and 14 new TIFs were created. It's for a total of 304 TIFs in the suburbs. The highest grossing TIFs in the suburbs are in, for the most part, the northern suburbs, Glenview, Hoffman Estates, Rosemont, Schaumburg. Cicero and Oak Park each have a TIF that's generating over $10 million as well. In the city of Chicago, though, as David mentioned, most of the highest grossing TIFs are in the central business district or around the central business district. And we have a little map over there showing where the 10 highest TIFs are. And most of them are near the loop or in the general area around the loop. The biggest TIF in the city of Chicago in terms of revenue this year was, for the third year in a row, the LaSalle Central TIF, which is bringing in $57 million just this year. The second highest grossing TIF in the city is the transportation TIF, the transit TIF. This is the second year of this TIF. Last year it brought in $18 million in its first year. This year it's more than doubled, bringing in $40 million. Transit TIFs are different than traditional TIFs in a number of ways. They're intended to fund public transportation projects. When the city council creates these transit TIFs, they don't have to show that there's any blight in the area. The TIF can run for 35 years. And additionally, the transit TIF itself doesn't get all of the money that it generates. Part of the money goes to the other taxing districts. CPS, for instance, receives the portion that it would get from property taxes. So this year, of the $40 million that the transit TIF generated, $21 million will go to CPS. Of what's left over, the transit TIF itself gets 80%, and this year that's $15 million. And of the other 20%, which is about $4 million, that is spread proportionally along all of the other taxing districts. So we have a lot of detail in our TIF report that is available online. We have quick facts, we have some frequently asked questions, we have an overview of both the city and the suburban TIFs, as well as a fact sheet for the transit TIF. We also have a number of other tools available on our website. We've got some TIF maps and reports. We also have a nice little 5-minute Understanding TIFs video, which is a nice overview of how TIFs work in Cook County and in Illinois. And additionally, we have our TIF Viewer application, which is an interactive mapping application. Lets you see where TIFs are, overlaid with aerial imagery and tax parcels, and see how much money all the active TIFs in Cook County are generating this year and last year and over their entire lives. And this is all data that can be downloaded, and you can bring it into Excel and play with it. Additionally, we are very excited. Very soon we will be releasing a TIF dashboard, which will use some GIS mapping technology to create some really neat data visualizations about the Cook County TIFs. We're hoping to have that in the next few weeks. So I encourage you to visit our website and take a look at all of the reports and maps and things that we have available about TIFs, and to watch for our upcoming dashboard. Thank you.
Questions?
What caused the increase for the revenue report organization last year to this year?
So EAVs in Cook County as a whole and in the city of Chicago went up, in Chicago went up just under 5%. So the value within the TIF increased. So it had a base value, and then I think there was about 5% of increment last year, incremental growth last year. Now there's another 5%. So it's basically the growth in the TIF has doubled.
And then what are EAVs?
I'm sorry, equalized assessed values, taxable value.
Forgive me if this is a dense question.
No.
This is complicated.
Yes, I am still trying to wrap my mind around all of this. So because of this record-breaking amount, that would mean then property values have gone up then a significant amount?
So yeah, I mean, we released our tax rate report back in June, and we show how EAVs, or taxable values, have increased in different areas of the county. But yes, in general, in the city, taxable values increased about 5%. TIFs are a factor pretty much of the tax rate of all of the taxing districts and the taxable value growth that has occurred within the TIF. So as that value grows, more money goes to the TIF.
Does it always
Also,
go by
just-
5%?
This might help too. Remember, we said earlier, in Chicago, 1 out of 4 properties are in a TIF. In the suburbs, we calculate about 1 out of 22. Okay, so part of that is simply that you have a lot more properties in Chicago that are paying into the TIF. Okay? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Does it always rise by 5% communities?
No, it depends on what's happening with assessments and with the state-issued equalizer each year. So it's analysis that we do every year. In June, we typically put out our tax rate release, which has information about taxable values. And then a few weeks later, we do the TIF release after we've had time to see what's happening specifically with TIFs.
So it's totally dependent on like the area, like if it's a lower area, your TIFs will have less money because the homes and property values are valued less.
It depends on how much the value has grown since, sorry. It depends on how much the property value has grown since the TIF was established. So if the value was very low at the beginning of the TIF and it hasn't increased much, then the TIF won't get much. But if the value was very low at the beginning of the TIF and there's been a lot of development, then the TIF will get more money.
So this totally depends on like property tax assessments and stuff too, like the assessor's office, the assessment stuff is not happening.
Definitely has an impact.
If you want, you might go back, it's only not that old, but to look at the last release about the taxes, because it's very relevant to this TIF issue. At that point, we tried to point out that people went, oh, gee, my property values have gone down. How come my taxes are going up? Well, we did some comparisons at the time. If you look at that release, you look at a place like Skokie that has an amazing number of shopping centers and brings in all that commercial revenue. And you take a couple areas, like south suburbs, that have none of that, okay? The towns still have to have a levy. They've got to pay for police, ideal, and other things. So their levies rarely go down. They may go up, okay? But then that's why the rate is much higher for generally poor people. And it's a massive inequality that we've yet to find a way to deal with, which is why so many people say you shouldn't have schools, for example. Schools shouldn't depend on property taxes because in poor areas, they don't have enough money to do that. So if you want to look back at that tax release, we have that too. Anybody else?
I just had a question. You're critical of how the distribution works now. Do you have any suggestions? You're almost on your way out. Do you have any suggestions on how the city should be doing this distribution?
Well, several. I've tried to point out today specific suggestions. I'm trying to get into explain why these things happen. You can talk about good public policy, but the reality is politics is the art of managing conflict. People need to understand why things happen as they do. I'm suggesting, particularly with the TIF funds, the fundamental problem is that we have a mayor who tends to be far more interested in the downtown area and what you might say a little bit of a he certainly has not had the same policies that former Mayor Washington had in terms of his impact on the neighborhoods. But I don't blame it all on the mayor. The mayor, so the key thing is, that's why I talked about the automatic prerogative. Okay, so the question is, if in fact these things are true, you take the transportation TIF out, and it's almost all in central areas, okay, and therefore some aldermen are capturing millions and millions of dollars every year. Well, what about all the others? Usually aldermen, see, at budget time, all 50 aldermen help shape, okay? I mean, in a real democracy, sometimes Chicago's not quite a real democracy for other reasons. But in a real democracy, that is the body that can set the policy, okay? But if in fact aldermen are saying, know what, I don't care what you do, you know, you've got 12 TIFs worth $220 and $220 million. I only have one or two that have brought in no revenue. You know, that's why if you look at these individual numbers, you'll see it. So what I'm suggesting is, as long as that automatic prerogative, that is one of the main problems in not having a better process of deciding TIFs and how they're spent. Again, I'm not against TIFs, but I would suggest one of the things, that's why I mentioned River West. who've done some good things to make some improvements in the neighborhood. But $142 million, at the same time, we're closing schools and mental health centers. So it's the balance we're looking for. And I'm suggesting we're not getting that balance, partly because it's aldermanic prerogative, and partly because of the lack of accountability and visibility. The fourth group that I didn't mention, I mentioned the powerful business and corporation, I mentioned the mayor, city council. The fourth is the public, and put the media in there, okay? But when it's very hard to understand, I mean, a lot of this stuff may be relatively new to you, to understand where the money's going and why and how, okay? Or that when TIFs are discussed, it's not a thing where everybody's in it. They bring the big guns and explain everything to the aldermen in that particular TIF area. Other aldermen don't get all that information, okay? What I'm saying, that's a fundamental problem if your goal is to think of the public interest at large. We want River West to develop. Beautiful area now. But we also have to look at this larger city. And when we see some of the things going on in the larger city, we wonder, why are they getting such a pittance when just, like I mentioned before, just take those top 10, generating, what was the percentage? Generating almost 50% of this large chunk of money, $666 million. So the other things, very quickly, is that we believe if there were audits that are very carefully done every year, you need to close some. Like River West, they've done all these things, but they're still generating all this money, and we're not sure where it's going to go. So there's where, if you close TIFs earlier, you don't have to go 23 years. See, part of this you have to understand, the political reality is, if you're the mayor and you got all this money coming in, when you got all these other problems, are you going to take it? Okay? The question is you should be giving some of that back, because like I said, 620 of that million, okay, that we're generating, none of that's going to the schools. So I just want to, there is a relationship between closing 50 schools because we got no money and spending hundreds of millions of dollars on projects, no offense, but remember, a lot of these projects are to help the most powerful corporations in the world. And the whole point behind TIFs was in a blighted area where no private money would go in. That's the key. But what if, whatever that phrase is, that in other words, where you can't get private money, like the North Howard area when I was 49th Ward Alderman, okay? There's where the public comes in. But the real question now, you look at River West and $1 million condominiums and so forth, and we're still pouring in, I don't remember the exact million this year's, but millions, 32 maybe? 20, okay, we're still pouring that into that TIF. So the question is that an area where it's kind of blighted and therefore we got to keep putting that money in? Or could that money be better used to deal with other issues in the city? But fairly simple, if you put it in those terms, and I think we could do much better, but I'm trying to suggest to you the structural reasons why we seem, because other cities don't do this, why we seem so inept. Other cities don't do it this way. The legislators are responsible for the whole city, not just their immediate neighborhood. So it's a challenge I'm throwing out to people, to think about the consequences of the way we do it now. Okay? Okay, thank you.